Okay, so welcome everybody to this event this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't met me before, my name is Emma and I'm part of the team at Untangle. So today we are very lucky to be joined by Eloise Skinner. Eloise is a therapist, author, teacher, amongst many other things. She's also the founder of two businesses, Purpose Workshop and One Typical Day. And we're very lucky to have her with us this evening. So tonight, Eloise will talk to us about the field of existential therapy, so what that is, what that means, and how it can help us work through grief, loss, change, and transition. So Eloise has got a presentation for us, and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. But if anything comes up throughout the talk, feel free to pop the question in the chat, and then hopefully we can answer it as we go. So yeah, thank you much again for coming tonight, and I'll hand over to you, Eloise.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is actually my second event that I've done with Untangled, so I'm really excited to be back. I think before I talked a little bit more about like higher level sort of well-being tools and from the practical perspective as well. So maybe some of you guys saw that, or maybe there's a recording of that somewhere. But if not, this is a little bit more on the therapeutic side. So yeah, just to tell you about my background with existential therapy. I started training in this about 5 years ago, and it's really a field that is a little bit undiscovered in the broader like sort of therapy scene. So I'd say the main sort of therapies that people recognize these days are things like CBT, or kind of a Jungian approach might be a more mainstream type of therapy, or there's lots of different types of like talking therapy now. Existential therapy is a little bit newer, so it's one of the newest schools of psychotherapy. And I personally think this is one of the therapies of the future. Like, I think it's very much focused on the things that a lot of us feel these days: fear of change, fear of being in transition, things changing around us and not being able to find our place in the world. This is the kind of topics that this therapy really deals with. So the main ideas here are finding meaning, finding purpose, and finding a sense of belonging within the world and within yourself. And this field of therapy also has a lot to say about grief and sort of what that means for us and how we can move through it. And there is actually also a suggested sort of transitional process through grief that this field of therapy introduces. I would just say before I go through these slides, also I haven't done this talk, this particular set of slides before, so I'm not sure how long it's going to take. So please do jump in if you have questions. I would just say before I start that this is not the only way to think about these topics, of course. And if you're going through other forms of therapy, or if you found a particular style of therapy that works for you, this is not like the ultimate way of looking at anything. It's kind of just like a selection of ideas, and hopefully you find some of them helpful. But if not, you know, it doesn't need to be adopted as part of the way you think about things. So that's just a little disclaimer to say it's really up to you how you take these things, and hopefully you'll find some of it helpful. And if not, like, well, it's just another perspective. There will be there are some little intentions and kind of notes, like suggestions for either journaling or work with your therapist or work with friends and family. So if you have a notebook and you want to take notes, like there might be little places where you can do that. And yeah, I think I already said this, but if you do have questions, please just drop them in the chat and I will try my best to get through them. So yeah, this is Grief and Existential Approach, which I don't think is the name of the title that I gave originally, but when I was doing these slides, I was like, I think I'm going to make it a little bit more focused on grief, because that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So firstly, what is existential therapy? So actually the main book in this field is a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is this little book by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, and he experienced the Holocaust. He lived through multiple concentration camps and lost most of his family members, including his fiance, his pregnant fiance, and lots of his like family as well. And then wrote about his experiences in this book. So about half of this book, I would say, is Viktor Frankl's autobiography element of his life, talking about his own experiences in the concentration camps. And then the second half is his introduction to his field of therapy, which is really based around those experiences in the camps. So I would really recommend getting a hold of this book. It's very short, but it kind of introduces his field of therapy, which he originally called logotherapy, logos, from the Greek word meaning or purpose. So it's kind of like purpose-orientated therapy. And these days, this book has sort of given rise to a broader field called existential therapy, which many people have written about. I only put my own books on here, but there are many, many, many other people who have written about it as well. But I wrote about this field, existential therapy, in these two books that are on the thing. So if you wanted a little introduction to existential therapy, it's in both of those books. So yeah, the field of existential therapy really is based around the main idea that each human being is driven to find meaning in their lives. And this is really considered to be the driving force or the motivation for all human behavior. So for everything that we do, everything that we search for, every decision we make about our careers or our life, or what we're going to do with our time, this field of therapy thinks a lot of it is linked to this search or the drive for meaning. And sometimes this can be a little bit hidden. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're having an existential crisis and we're thinking, I don't know what to do with my life. I really need to find a purpose, or I need to find meaning. But it could be, for example, if we're living a life that kind of just starts to feel quite monotonous, or we sort of lose ourselves a little bit, we lose the connection to ourselves. And it can also lead to things like sort of just falling into a feeling of not necessarily depression, but just like low mood or low energy. This field of therapy would say that some of those things can be alleviated, or at least assisted, by finding a really strong connection to our meaning and our purpose in our lives. So this is the kind of thing that Viktor Frankl talks about in this book, which I highly recommend. There are a couple of other books as well that he has. This one is called Yes to Life, in Spite of Everything. And this one, The Will to Meaning. So you can see they're all kind of on the same theme. So Viktor Frankl, yeah, if you want any other recommendations, I have many, many others related to him. He didn't talk about grief specifically, or like set out the framework for grief that I'm going to talk about. That was more developed by his students and the people who have come after him. But he does outline sort of his approach to grief in Man's Search for Meaning. So if you wanted to dive into that, that's my recommendation. All right. So what is grief according to existential therapy? So I'm just going to try and move. Actually, sorry, I can't see my mouse anymore. I'm going to try and move the thing. Okay, perfect. All right. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Oh no, my mouse. Wait, sorry guys. This is like, sometimes my mouse will just like disappear on this thing. Okay, here we go. What is grief according to existential therapy? So this is the definition that this field gives: the loss of a value or a relationship to someone or something that is important to us. So it ultimately doesn't have to be a person. It could be a connection to a time in our lives, or to a job that we had, or to an item that we have, and we can be grieving the loss of something. It also doesn't have to be a thing. It could be a value. So something that we lost in our lives that we can grieve, a previous time when we felt like we were a certain person, or we felt like we were working with a certain value that was in our lives previously, and then we lost that. And it also can be connected to both a sense of personal suffering and a sense of self-compassion. So as we go through this like little introduction from the existential perspective, you'll see that existential therapy puts a really big emphasis on grief being a very personal experience, in which there is an opportunity to come closer to yourself and to really get to know yourself, I guess, in sort of more basic terms, and to really develop a sense of self-compassion and connection to the self. So on the one hand, there's the suffering, and on the other hand, there's the opportunity to come deeper into relationship with yourself. Now, this might not be something that necessarily resonates with you. And again, these are sort of just perspectives. But going back to Viktor Frankl's work, this is his idea that suffering ultimately sort of transforms or changes its shape when we give it meaning. So when we look at suffering, for his example, in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, like around him, there was suffering everywhere, lots of, like the worst conditions you could imagine. But for the people that were able to give that experience a deeper meaning, or to find some kind of purpose within that experience, those were the people that he witnessed sort of have a transformative experience, where they were able to come out of that and rebuild their lives, and not fall into despair, and not ultimately succumb to, either just giving up or losing hope, or kind of just like being almost like not necessarily like a victim of the experience, but a person that the experience was happening to, rather than someone who kind of was able to take the experience and use it for their own self-development. And again, this is like not the only way to look at these topics, of course, but just like an idea. The other thing in existential therapy is that we can be grieving someone or something or a value that is still in our lives, that is still present. So maybe it's someone, a person that we don't have contact with anymore, or it's a person that we broke up with, like in terms of a relationship, or it's a thing that is still present in our lives, but we just don't have access to it in the same way that we did before. And that could be either due to the thing or the person moving on, or our own decision. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an experience that is kind of pushed upon us. It might be a decision that we made, and then we're feeling grief as a result of that. So grief doesn't only have to be like a negative sort of a thing that we're subject to. It could be something that we decided to sort of move on, and then grief is a natural part of the process of sort of transforming that experience onwards. All right, let me see if I can click this because I'm suspicious of my mouse now. Okay. 3 initial questions that existential therapy would ask, and this is what you would do if you were in therapy with an existential therapist. These are the kind of things you'd be talking about. Number 1, existential therapy can be a little confronting, by the way, which is why some of these questions are a bit like, they go right into the sort of like heart of everything. Am I powerful enough to continue? Do I have the strength to continue my life? And that might sound like a question that a lot of us don't even consider, because we just think we just have to keep going. Like regardless of what happens to us, like we get up the next day and then we have to like keep going. Existential therapy really tries to take you back to the actual decision that you make to keep going every day. Am I strong enough to continue to keep going? Will I be able to? Like, am I powerful enough to like keep living my life, even though this thing has happened or this experience has happened to me? And then most people faced with this question will answer yes, like I am strong enough to continue. And then you can move on to the next question. But it kind of is the real foundation of where this work takes place, like your will to keep going, to like keep continuing your life. Will my life still have value? Am I able to continue to create value? So this values-based question is a little bit more about like, what are you going to do with your life now that this thing has happened? How will you respond to the things that happen to you? How will you choose to design a life that is still meaningful and still has like the value that you attributed it to it before the experience of grief? How will you continue to like perpetuate that value going forwards? And this third question, existential therapy is very big on like what you like and what you don't like. And it really sees like likes and dislikes as a real demonstration of the vitality that we have for our lives. So you can imagine a life where you didn't really like or dislike anything, where you just felt kind of empty and you didn't really care about anything at all. That in existential therapy terms would not really be seen as like the full fulfillment of your life. But when we have strong likes and strong dislikes, this is seen as kind of like life is flowing through us. We're like, we've got a drive, we've got ambition, we know what we want, we know what we don't want. So liking and disliking is a really big theme in this field, and it's really seen as the way that you can define your life and the way that you can sort of have the energy to move through your life. So this third question is about liking. Would I like to get involved in life again? Can life still be good if such a fundamental part of it is lacking? And it's important to note that you don't have to answer yes to all of these questions immediately. You don't have to sort of go into this process and be like, right, I'm ready to like go for it, new values, new kind of like moving forwards. It's more just like these are sort of the foundational questions that this field would address if you were moving through existential therapy on the topic of grief. So just some kind of like framing questions, I guess. Okay. So the existential activity in grief, it's a bit of like a textbook. I actually think I took that term out of a textbook. So sorry if it sounds a bit like academic. But essentially existential therapy is about your life. So this means that when you go into therapy as someone who's working with an existential therapist, everything that you do or the work that you do or the kind of like process that you go through is very much focused on you and not necessarily focused on the experiences that happen to you or like the things that are happening around you, but just on you and like how you would like to respond to the things that are happening like around you or to you. So in terms of your life, grief encourages a turning towards yourself, a personal dealing with yourself in relation to a loss that is deeply felt. So this idea of turning towards, we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but essentially existential therapy really sees like the grief experience as an opportunity for you to turn towards yourself, to deepen the relationship with yourself, and to ultimately experience the loss in such a way that you can use that to move onwards with the loss, you know, or like work through the loss in a way that is still like accompanying yourself through it, if that makes sense. The loss requires us to form a new relationship to life, a new touching base with myself and my life that now feels different. So it's important that there's an acknowledgement of the things that have happened or the place that you are right now, and then ultimately a movement forwards. And this can be a very, very slow process. This is not something that happens, you know, 3 weeks after the experience that you've had, you're suddenly like on the track to sort of re-evaluating everything. This could be however long it takes. It's not like a set timetable, but it could be months or years, or depending on, you know, how you're working and what's going on for you. So this is one question that you would potentially be asked in existential therapy. In what ways does my life feel different now? So here you would list out all of the things that are different about your life, like comparing before and after. Those could be obviously things that are really challenging, things that are difficult, and also things that are like maybe not necessarily positive, but things that you've taken from the experience that are of value to you. So an experience, a sort of positive type experience might be you have a deeper appreciation for your connections with some other people in your life that weren't that strong before, or you have a deeper appreciation of the everyday. You have like, you know, a more deep experience of what it means to live and to be fully alive in your everyday moments. And maybe the experience of grief has kind of intensified that in some ways. That might not be the case, or it might be a different thing entirely, but you would just make a huge list of both, like in all ways that your life feels different. Okay. Okay, so this is the 3-stage process that is kind of suggested. And again, this is it's so difficult to be like, this is the process and there are 3 steps, and like everyone, because obviously everyone is so different. And if you've come across sort of the stages of grief in the Kubler-Ross tradition, this is sort of similar idea, a bit different in terms of the content. But again, as with that model, the 5 stages of grief model, this is not like necessarily a linear process, and it's not really even something that everyone would move through necessarily in that order or even at all. So it's really just trying to frame a very, very personal and individual experience on some higher levels that people might experience sort of elements of these 3 stages. So the grieving process, number 1, letting be. This is kind of like the acceptance of what is happening, or the acknowledgement, or coming to terms with the reality of what is happening. So these are some things that were suggested under this heading: letting feelings flow freely, staying with your feelings, accepting the feelings of chaos, struggle, bitterness, injustice, rebellion, exhaustion. Accepting cyclical or the unpredictable nature of feelings. So this is the idea that you don't necessarily move through the stages of like, you know, this week you're exhausted and then next week you're going to be better, but not necessarily in the sense that you're always like kind of stepping up and up and up until you're great again, but in the sense that everything is kind of cyclical or changing. And, you know, there are times when you go this way and then that way, and there's no set pattern for how you should be responding to things, really. So it's mostly just about acknowledgement and being present with what is actually happening. And then this is just a note, this is more on the therapy side, but this is a really important stage to move through, the letting be part of like sitting with the feelings, or like working through the acknowledgement of the feelings, because it's thought that in this field of therapy, at least, that if you don't reach the kind of letting be stage, that you get caught in what they would call a coping reaction, which is when you haven't really come to terms with what is happening. So you kind of get just pushed back again and again to like the beginning stages of the cycle. So that could be like, numbing sort of the feelings in any kinds of ways. That could be sort of diving into work, could be one example, to sort of not deal with what is happening, or into a new relationship, or depending on what the grief is related to. If the grief is related to, say, like the loss of a job, let's say, then like immediately getting a new job in the same field, trying to replace the thing that you lost immediately without sort of coming to terms with what it was that you were grieving, if that makes sense. So this stage can last for however long. And again, it's kind of just like a personal experience, just observing it is the main thing. Okay, so some other things on this stage. At first, there is a feeling of being powerless. But there is one thing that is possible whenever you feel powerless within this cycle. You can choose to remain with yourself, come close to yourself, turn towards yourself, care for yourself, and empathize with yourself. This is a real idea from Viktor Frankl, actually, of that we always have a choice, even when we feel most powerless, or even when we feel like we can't do anything about our circumstances. We always have a choice, and that choice is the choice to choose our reactions to things, or to choose how we're going to respond to things. So the example that is given in Man's Search for Meaning is in the context of the concentration camps. There was no choice about what to do every day, or like where to be, or how to structure your life in any kind of way. You had no sort of personal freedoms whatsoever. But Viktor Frankl writes that you always had the choice to choose your response to the things that happened to you. So you could see it as something that was like forced upon you and has ruined your life. And, you know, this is kind of like the end, which would be fair enough, to be honest, in that circumstance, to have that response. Or he was sort of working with people who also saw it as an opportunity for them to find their own inner strength, to find a sense of determination, to take the things that were given to them, or the things that were coming their way, as a challenge that they were going to rise to and find some meaning beyond that. So, I mean, this is the idea that, you know, anything can happen to you in the world, anything at all, and you always have the power to choose your own response to it. This is actually very, very tricky to do in practice, because ultimately when things happen to us, we just instinctively respond most of the time. So it takes a lot to be like, to take a step back and think, how do I actually want to respond to this? But especially for an experience like grief, which can be quite prolonged over our lives, or a feeling of change or transition, we often are faced with these quite similar feelings that come up, and then we have multiple choices to respond in the way that we would like to. So this can be just a mindset shift, really, but also something you can practice on quite a practical or personal level. So you can even make some notes in like a journal about, like, you know, when this feeling comes up, I would like to respond in this way. So say if the loss is like a breakup, like a relationship breakup, when the feelings of like missing that person or wanting to contact that person come up, I'm going to respond by making a list of all the things that are good about my life now and all the things that I'm looking forward to in the future. Or say for a bereavement, when I am sort of overcome with grief in relation to that, I am going to call a friend who also knows that person and talk to them, or journal, or go for a walk, or like whatever your decision is. But it's more like an intentional, like, when this comes up, I would like to respond in this way. And you don't always have to do that. It's kind of just like, it's something that is on offer to you if you felt like you wanted to reclaim a sense of not necessarily power, but sort of self-determination, let's say, over a situation. And this is just for the first stage. It's important not to fight, resist, deny, or negotiate. You kind of just deal with things as they come. And this is quite similar to the 5 stages of grief model. So that obviously has like bargaining, depression, things like that. So this is the stage where you're kind of just accepting where you are and what's happening. Okay. So these are some like little intentions, or almost like mantras, or like little reminders you can have for yourself, or little phrases you can say to yourself during this kind of like first stage process. I am here, I'm present. So this is the idea of just being with yourself. I'm doing nothing. That's quite a nice mantra to have sometimes, quite relaxing, even outside of this context. I'm just gonna let things be as they are. I let everything be as it is. I'm protected, safe, and supported. That just means in relation to yourself. That doesn't necessarily mean in relation to anything else. It's more just like a sense that you're going to protect yourself, that you're going to look after yourself, you're going to support yourself. So you'll sort of see the theme emerging in this field of therapy, which is very like, you stand alongside yourself, like you stand with yourself in whatever you're going through. This was actually one of the biggest things for me when I was training. I actually lost a friend very unexpectedly during my training, actually while we were working through one of the modules which was related to grief. And he was my age, like late 20s at the time when I was doing my training, and it was just like completely out of the blue, and it was like so shocking. And this kind of work, I wasn't really ready to like start processing or like moving forwards, but this kind of like staying with yourself or like not abandoning yourself during the process of grief or trauma was absolutely transformative for me, because I think my instinct would be to sort of like try and distract myself or like try and get away from myself in a way that would like not have to sit with it. And this kind of practice where you're like practicing staying close to yourself or practicing not abandoning yourself, this was absolutely like transformative for me in my own practice. So it could be something, it's partly a mindset shift and it's partly a practical technique or tool that you can use. Okay. So this is stage 2. This is kind of after the letting be stage. And you don't have to work through these again in like a linear way, but this could be something that kind of naturally happens as you start to move through or start to like work through the process. So again, this is the feeling of like basically what I was just talking about, turning towards yourself, remaining with yourself, experiencing a sense of closeness to yourself. I feel that I am with myself throughout the suffering and loss. The relationship with myself persists in spite of my suffering. And this is I don't really know how this is, like whether this is translated that well, because a lot of this work is in German, because it's a sort of Austrian-based field. But my suffering includes me within it. That's kind of the idea that your suffering isn't separate from you, but that it is sort of something that you're working through with yourself and not something that is, again, like coming externally that you have to kind of battle through, but something that is like an internal process that is also deepening your relationship to yourself as you're processing the suffering or processing the grief. Yeah, I don't know if that's the perfect phrasing for it really, but that's the idea. Some other ideas. My loss needs me to be present. So this is the idea that a loss represents a value. So whenever you're experiencing loss or grief, it is because of the importance of that thing. And so to honor the importance of that thing, the loss requires you to be present within it and not sort of try and run from it or escape it, as it were, but instead to sort of make space for it and also to honor like the process. That's just one idea. I'm caring and attentive with myself. I don't reject myself. I turn towards myself. I allow myself to be there for myself. There's a lot of myself stuff going on there. But the achievement here ultimately is to remain close to yourself despite the suffering. So yeah, that could be interpreted in different ways. Like everyone has a sort of different perspective of the relationship with the self. But ultimately the idea is to stand alongside yourself and not to abandon yourself during the process. So here are some intentions for the second stage. These 3 at the beginning. Number 1, I empathize with myself. Number 2, sorry, this is something my tutor always says. He's like he's a German guy, so I'm not sure if it entirely translates perfectly, but he always says, poor me. Like you stand alongside yourself and you say like, I'm suffering and I recognize that. So you feel a sense of sadness for yourself and like consolation for yourself. So you recognize that it's difficult, but it will get better. But at the moment it hurts, and that's like acceptable. And that's something that you will acknowledge and you won't overlook and you won't move away from, but you will like hold space for yourself while you're hurting. Number 3, I know this hurts, but it will change. So patience, acceptance. Talking about the future. Oh, these are kind of like therapy. These bullet points ones are more like therapy sort of things that you would talk about maybe in therapy. You would start talking about the future as well as the present. So you would start talking about what will be. And again, because this is the second stage of the process, this isn't something that you would do while you're coming to terms with the loss, but when you're starting to move through this sense of like self-connection, self-value, or like redetermining the values that you have for yourself, you're also thinking about the future here. Careful and tender dealing with myself, comforting myself, reassuring myself, not a self-indulgent process, but an active process. So there's a big emphasis on not using this. I mean, many people, let's say, would think of this sort of self-pity, or like not necessarily self-pity, but like self-sadness as a little bit self-indulgent. Like, you know, you're allowing yourself, you're saying, oh no, I'm really suffering and I kind of see that in myself. It's really important in this field of therapy that is not seen as self-indulgent, that is not seen as something that is like, you know, that you're taking like too much energy towards yourself, but is actually seen as an active process in the process of moving through grief. So this period of like turning towards yourself, looking after yourself, caring for yourself, acknowledging how difficult things are, that is like actually part of the process and not something that is seen as like an indulgence. And again, it cannot be replaced with comfort or consolation from others. I said consolidation there, but I meant consolation. So this is the sense that you should have support. Obviously, you should have friends and family, and you should be seeking like community or a therapist or another professional, but that the support from others will not replace this process that you go through with yourself. And it's really important that this is something that you do for yourself in addition to the other support that is available to you. That makes sense. Okay, questions that you could ask yourself during this stage. These are very practical things. So again, this stage is a little bit more like practical care for the self. So this is like asking yourself, what do I need, both in this moment and like maybe at the beginning of every day? What do I need today? Or what do I need when I know that things are going to be difficult, like in the evenings or in the mornings or whenever the thing, like the experience is most difficult? Or what do I need on this particular day that is going to be quite difficult for me? Planning out in advance, I think I will need, based on my experience of myself and how I know myself, silence or space or connection or dialogue or support or like getting moving or getting outside or eating well or sleeping better or whatever it is, the kind of practical steps. And this is stuff you can journal about or even like put in your diary in a very practical way. Like, I think I'm going to need this on this day. What would comfort me in this moment? So if you know that you have particular things that are comforting to you, like reminders or people that you need around or things that you need to do that are comforting to the self. The other thing is if you ever feel like you're not sure what it is that you would need or what it is that would comfort you, this is a really good sort of self-awareness exercise to do. So when you feel like you do something in your life that you feel like, oh, that actually was really helpful to me. Like when I felt overwhelmed, I went outside, I took 5 deep breaths, and then I like closed my eyes and just like stood there for a moment. And that was actually really helpful to me. And so when you come back in and go back to your day, you can make a note of like that little thing that you did that was actually really grounding or really helpful. Or I just walked away from the situation and I took some space and then that was helpful, or whatever it is. And then, yeah, another practical thing, how can I ask for what I need from others? So, yeah. All right, I think we're on to the final stage. Yeah. So the final stage, this is like really kind of late stage in the process. So this isn't something that, again, would happen at the beginning, but this is almost like a little bit more moving back into life. And life as it is going to be now, not life how it was, but life in the way that will be changed or developed or impacted or transformed by the experience that you've had. So I let myself, these are kind of like little ideas about this stage. Again, I let myself be with me. That's similar to the second stage. This stage is really about a movement. So like new things, new changes, new life. I feel an inner movement of emotions. It produces a change in me. It stirs new life within me. I step into a new relationship in relation to the loss. So that's kind of the sense of like carrying the loss forwards with you, which is really important in terms of like honoring the loss or honoring the value that you're taking forwards, if you feel like that is appropriate, depending on what your situation is. But stepping into a new relationship with it, one where you can kind of carry it without it being like too restrictive on your life as it goes forwards. Okay, grieving and relationships. Existential therapy sees grieving as a movement towards deepened relationships to others and to myself. This includes my own relationship to my own life. I think we kind of covered that because I said that many, many, many times now, but essentially the relationship to yourself is really fundamental to this process and to existential therapy as a whole. Grief leads to the preservation of relationship, not the destruction of it. So this is the idea that when you transform your loss, you don't have to give up your love for the person, the thing, situation, whatever it was that you've lost, but you change the way that it is lived going forwards. So it can transform the love or the relationship or the value from an external relationship, which was lived out in reality, to an internal relationship that no longer needs the external, that is transformed in a way that you're able to carry it forwards, if that makes sense. Again, these are kind of just ideas, so they may or may not resonate depending on what your perspective is, but life is bigger than the loss we experience, but we do have the space to carry it with us. Yeah. So that's the idea that for a while, or like throughout the grieving process, the loss is the center of your attention. And while you're developing your relationship with yourself, it sort of continues to be the center. But as you move through the process, it's still something that you take with you, but then you start to build on top of that, or you like start to build new values and new ideas around it. And so it's not just like leaving it behind, like that was then and this is now, but kind of like a transformation of the experience. And these are the last few slides. So yeah, grieving and aliveness, the sense of like being fully alive. This is a big theme in existential therapy. So this is kind of the idea that grief actually is part of life, in the sense that grief is an experience that most, if not all of us, will experience. And it's because of our deep connection to life and to others that we experience grief. I mean, if we had no deepened connection to other people or other things in our lives, if we lost something, we wouldn't like grieve it. We just kind of move forwards. Like the connection doesn't necessarily need to be like a good connection. It could be quite a difficult connection, but either way, there's kind of like a value or like something symbolic there for us. So it kind of is a representation of the fullness of the life that we do have. So existential therapy sees that there's quite a close threshold between grief and between that and a drive for a full experience of our lives. So grieving happens over the loss of something worth living for. I'm not sure if that's true in all cases. This is like sort of stuff that is kind of general, but it depends. Of something I attach my heart to. The experience of grief is an indication of the depth of our feelings and of the vitality that we still experience. So that's kind of linked to before when I said that likes and dislikes are a really big aspect of this field of therapy, because they show us that we have like a drive to either like something or dislike something. When we're experiencing grief, we have the same kind of drive to like mourn something. So again, it's a representation of the fullness or the vitality that we still do have in relationship to our lives. So it's yeah, it is a sign of our power, I guess. What are we letting go of? I think we kind of covered this already, but it could be like relationships, connections. And we can also mourn things like preconceptions or expectations that we had of a certain way that things would be. We have to let go sometimes of things like longing for a certain state of being or a certain time. And sometimes we're even letting go or mourning like not necessarily positive things or like good things, but things like fears or anxieties, sometimes we're letting go and we're actually grieving those as well, because grief isn't always like a process of mourning something that was ultimately a good thing all the time. Like sometimes things can be difficult for us and we can still mourn the loss of them because they represented an important value in our lives. Life still reaches me after and in spite of everything. So this is actually linked to Viktor Frankl's book, Yes to Life, in Spite of Everything, which is a really great title, I think. So basically, like, his work is based around the fact that we can still say yes to our lives, that we can still consent to like living a full and fulfilling life in spite of all the things that could and can and do happen to us. Affirming that yes, life is still worth living. I've experienced a loss, but through it, I have regained life. Yeah. Okay, so this is the last little bit, grieving and reorientation. So this is the turning back towards the world. And this in therapy is normally seen as the stage when people are ready to kind of go back into their lives or ready to re-engage in the way that they were before, ready to kind of start things in a way that they may not have felt comfortable doing before. And this is the time in therapy that normally you'll experience someone noticing the things that they have lost. So they're going back into the world and they're noticing like, oh, that's where the loss is becoming evident now. So going back into the workplace and things are different now because I don't have the thing that I had before. So when you turn back towards the world, you kind of have to face, you almost go back to the kind of like the acknowledgement stage of the whole process of like facing what it is that is different now. And that can sometimes feel like a bit of a step back, but is actually kind of towards the end of the process, because it is the point at which you're turning to face the world again. And so it really does become, it is an acknowledgement and a letting be again, but it's sort of not the same as it was like when you were beginning to do this kind of process. So establishing a new inward relationship to what you have lost. I don't have to give up the love. It is transformed. Life continues with the loss, or however you want to think about it. And establishing relationships to new values, to looking at the world with new eyes, so that it's possible to take up new relationships without fear. That one is a little bit based around a loss being like, say, a relationship or something that ended, but that you're not going to carry that forwards into like a new relationship. So that might not always apply, but it's just an example. Okay, grief work, and this is what you would do in therapy. Grief work is sometimes described as grief work in psychotherapeutic terms, but existential therapy doesn't really see it as work, because you can't force the process according to this field. So it is something that kind of just moves through you and your life in a way that is kind of like intuitive and instinctive for you. So they say grief should emerge by itself and is not accomplished, although it does involve activity and effort. And in therapy, you would have two focuses. You'd have the focus of you and your life. And then you'd also maybe be talking about like broader themes of grief in the way that I've kind of talked about them today. So you'd be talking about the stages and kind of how they work, but also just kind of where you are and like what's going on for you. So the 3 stages that you're working through over time. Oh yeah, I put in the role of tears because existential therapy always like really loves emotions, and so tears are really seen as like or whatever kind of like physical emotion is like connected to the grief is really seen as a sign of like the value that you had for the thing that you're grieving, and the vitality that you still have to kind of engage with the loss and kind of how you're going to move through it. So it really is seen as like a reaffirmation of life and like how you feel about your life. How to continue the relationship with the person, in terms of like transforming the grief or loss, or if the person is still around but you have no contact with them, how you're going to continue that, and how to shape your future. So what old values still matter and what new values matter now. So that's the final stage, is kind of like redefining. And I think, last one, it's important not to be afraid of grief in this field and in most fields of therapy, to be honest. So to face it, and the acknowledgement part is really important. Grieving is an intimate personal process in which life reinstates itself. And it's healing. It's a healing process and seen as a sort of beneficial process in terms of facilitating personal growth, reconnecting to yourself, and eventually establishing a life which still holds space for the loss, but is able to continue in new ways. So that is it. That, I think, how long did that take? Oh, that was okay. That was 45 minutes, which wasn't actually that bad. So let me know if you have any questions or anything, or anything else. Let me know. And yeah, these books again that I mentioned, I think Man's Search for Meaning is like probably the fundamental text that kind of sets out this field. Then there were some other Viktor Frankl books, and then a couple of my books. Yeah, I have this book which it kind of sets out, there's a whole chapter on existential therapy. It's not really a therapy book, it's kind of more broader like lifestyle stuff, but there is a chapter about existential therapy in there if that's interesting. But yeah, if you have any questions, I can't see the chat anymore, so I don't know where it's gone. I'm guessing if someone puts something in the chat, it will. Okay, now I can see it. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions, or if you want me to talk about a little bit more about the field in general, like other aspects of the field, if that's interesting. But I can chat for the next like 10 minutes or so if you guys want to. Or if there's anything that kind of like resonated, or anything that didn't resonate, if you're going through other like other approaches to this topic, like I would love to know as well. I think it is really such a personal thing ultimately, that everyone has a different experience of it, but it's always interesting to see different views. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Um, and it's if existential therapy has a approach on how to maybe repair a relationship when one person is like dead, the- how to
Yeah.
maybe change something. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you mean by can you just expand on repair? Like, do you mean kind of like deepen the connection to that relationship?
Yeah, I feel like I was kind of expecting my mom to die. I subconsciously, and I think subconsciously I tried to defend myself from the grief,
Mm.
and I started to destroy the relationship and to cut the bonds with her and to maybe not be too emotionally connected to her. Now I feel like my very ground, because she was my basically my own. She raised me and she was the most important person in my life, and now I don't know who I am.
Mm.
No, no.
Yeah, so and again, like I would if I was actually doing therapy, there would be a lot of work in just kind of like working through the experience and kind of what happened and how you felt about it. But on a quite a high level, I would say, I mean, firstly, it sounds completely in terms of psychotherapy, at least, like a very rational response to like a loss that is anticipated to kind of reduce the emotional connection with that. So I would say, it's nothing that is you know irrational in that at all. So I think some of it would be around sort of exploring the connection and what was important and kind of taking the values from that connection and seeing how those values could be deepened in your everyday life. So that would be kind of the relationship that you had with your mum and like what was important within that. Um, and then the other thing would be, and this is a lot of like existential therapy is really big on building like the foundation, like you mentioned, of your life. That is just work that is normally done just for you, like as an individual, and not necessarily related to your relationship with anyone else. But this is the sense of like finding belonging within your life, like building your foundational values, finding meaning and purpose and things that are important to you, really finding your sense of your identity. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can kind of just do it through like talking therapy, as in like if you're working through it with a therapist. But there are also a lot of different practical exercises you can do where you're listing out your values and you're saying like, these are the important things to me in my life. These are the important experiences. These are the important relationships. And over time, like it does take a while to do this kind of foundational work, but over time you build up this holistic picture of like, this is who I am and these are the values that I have. And like, this is how I'm going to move through the world. So there would be a lot of, it sounds like in that scenario, a lot of work that's kind of around rebuilding your foundations in a way that's true and meaningful to you. And then with the connection, sort of diving into what were the values that were represented by that connection. And is there any way that you can sort of find those values in other ways in your life or other ways that you can find them in other connections, like aspects of what was important there? But yeah, I would say, I mean, the first thing that you obviously already have, which sometimes can take a while, is sort of unraveling what you need, and you already sound quite clear about what you need. So I think, it could be something that you start to work on, and that could be very successful for you in terms of like reestablishing your values and what's important. If that makes sense. That was a very high level summary, but
Thank you.
yeah, no, of course. It's always hard to like it's hard to say like without knowing too much, but yeah, what did you guys think? Was this like similar to stuff that because I'm not super familiar. I have a high level understanding of like other fields of psychotherapy, but is this similar to stuff that you've come across before, this type of approach, or is it a little different, or what do you think? Is it helpful?
Um, I think it was really, really good, Eloise. And it's something that I've not come across before. It's certainly something that, to be honest, I really felt that I needed to hear today. So I really appreciate, that presentation. I actually wondered whether you could, I don't know, list out some of those books. I think I missed it in the beginning to write them down, but I don't know, maybe if it could be put on the app or on the um uh in the chat or something.
Yeah,
Uh,
let me write in the chat actually. Viktor Frankl. Okay, so man's search. Oh, sorry. Also, let me just saw your question. 1 second. His main book, Man's Search for Meaning, and then the other ones I mentioned were Yes to Life, In Spite of Everything. And then his other one that I mentioned was, I mean, he has a ton of books, but these are The Will to Meaning. Those are kind of like, again, they're not grief specific, but they're kind of his field of psychotherapy. I don't know if you know this quote that it often gets shared around, but it's like it's actually not a Viktor Frankl quote. It's always attributed to him, but he didn't actually say it. It was someone trying to paraphrase his work, but essentially the quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space, we always have the power to determine our reactions or responses to things. So that's the idea that nothing ever just happens to us and we always have to like respond in a certain way, but that we are always given the opportunity to choose how to respond to something. This is kind of the main, I would say, if this field of therapy could be summed up, it would be like that idea of like, you have the ability to choose how to respond to things, which is actually much easier said than done, obviously, but that's the idea. So yeah, Helen, in terms of often feeling like you can't cry, yeah, I mean, I think everyone is different again. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, the physiological side of it, I mean, tears are just one example of the expression of grief through the body, but it can obviously be expressed in many, many other different ways. I would say, I don't know where you feel like you are in terms of those 3 stages, or if any of those 3 stages resonated, but sometimes you have to stay with that first stage for a long time, like longer than you think, of the stage of like letting be and accepting and kind of like looking at the situation like front on. That's a horrible way of describing it, but like looking at things before the body is able to process like the physiological reaction. Because sometimes we are so conditioned, and this might be either our upbringing or just society in general, to be honest, we're so like habituated into like moving on from things without really having the time to like sit with it and process it. And it can take longer than you think, and it can take longer than seems socially acceptable, and it can take longer than you would like it to. But sometimes this can be the stage where that like sort of body related process can sort of catch up with where your mind and, you know, your external circumstances are. So I'd say try like some of those like the letting be sort of like the letting be stages, like those intentions, or working through them either with a therapist or whoever you have, like support groups and things like that, the kind of acknowledgement stage. And over time, I mean, again, not everyone needs to fit a particular pattern. So if it just isn't something that's like, if tears aren't the way that you're going to express, like, it doesn't mean that it's any less important or less valuable. But yeah, I do think sometimes we can like race through the kind of like, we're going to get on with this kind of attitude, and like we're just going to like cope, and then we're going to like process, and then we're going to get back to what we were doing before. And I think this field of therapy, at least, and most fields of therapy, to be honest, leave a huge space for like coming to terms with things, or like, you know, and again, this is not a linear process, so you might feel like you have already accepted it, but then you want to return to kind of the acceptance or the letting be stage again. But yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that is a very that's a complex question, and like really interesting as well. I think, yeah, these are more specific things. The existential therapy does have a role, like obviously it is a clinical field of therapy. Oh yeah, thank you. It is the clinical field of therapy, so it does have like strategies for PTSD, things like self-related complexities. What I would say is the work that I described today is really designed for where it's able to have a connection with the self. It's kind of like a higher level sort of where the self is accessible in a way that feels comfortable and like safe. So I would say for things that are a bit more specific, like PTSD, I would definitely either work with a therapist or work with a field that is slightly more like focused or specific on those things, just because they are a little bit more, they need a little bit more attention to approach, if that makes sense. Like a lot of this stuff that I mentioned today is quite holistic. It's kind of like designed for like well-being strategies rather than like real sort of therapeutic stuff. So yeah, that was a long disclaimer of like saying that maybe those things are a little bit more specific, although an existential therapist would be able to deal with them. So it could be something that you take to a therapist, if that makes sense. Sorry if that wasn't like a very high level answer. But yeah, well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me talk about this field, which I personally think is like, even outside of the things that we've spoken about today, I personally think this field is like really exciting, and really for me has been absolutely like, has changed my perspective on the world. So if it's not clear how much I love this field and think of its importance, yeah, I recommend, like, if you feel like diving in, start with Man's Search for Meaning, see what you think. And yeah, I hope that it's been a helpful introduction. But I'm on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Eloise Alexia. I'll just put it in the chat. So if you do have any questions, I'll check my DMs if you wanted to get in touch. Or I have a website, you can email me there. So if there's anything else, like, please do reach out. Or if you want more book recommendations, always love to share book recommendations. So let me know. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.